Hello, class, and welcome to this class on the history and process of creativity. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie. It's really difficult to research or teach or study creativity without first having a good definition of what creativity is. Here are a few of my favorite definitions. So Webster's describes creativity as artistic or intellectual inventiveness. Yeah, not terribly helpful, I think. Kelvin Paler considers there to be about 1,000 different definitions floating out there. And so it makes it obviously very difficult in defining creativity. But here are some other definitions that I think might be a little bit helpful. The ability to bring into being or form out of nothing. To bring into being by force of imagination. I really like that idea. The personal and skillful rearrangement of images of external reality. So, in essence, you're taking things from the environment and bringing them in and rearranging them in a way that is very personable and personal and skillful. And then one of my favorites, the attempt to mold a sense of order out of chaos. Now, my feeling is that when we are creative, we are kind of like heroes. We're kind of like a mythic hero. We venture out of the known world and we venture into chaos. And we try to bring something back from that chaotic, dangerous world. And that chaos into the known world in a form that illuminates other people, and therefore making part of that chaos part of the known world. And that was the goal of ancient heroes, the mythic heroes. And I think that is, in a sense, what a creative person does. When they engage in creative activities, however, none of these things are really, shall we say, scientific or measurable. And so let's look at what we'll be looking at here. So there are measurable types of creativity most researchers use. For example, Frank Barone's criterion, namely that it is original. So obviously originality is part of what it means to be creative. And secondly, that it be useful or adaptive in some way. Some way it is adapted to reality. So it is something that is novel and original and useful. Now, some might ask the question, why does something need to be useful? Well, there's a lot of things out there in the world that are novel and original, but are not what we would categorize as creative. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I know of a 2-year-old that I visited and had a meal with. She pulled out her crayons and was very vigorously putting crayon on the table and on the paper. And while these marks might be original, they wouldn't be what you would call creative, at least not yet. They may be creative later on, and I'm sure that this young individual will be creative as she grows up. But for right now, there isn't really any usefulness for her works in the greater world. Likewise, you could argue that tire marks on the highway are original, But we wouldn't call a teenager peeling out and burning their rubber tires on the asphalt as being an artist. It's not something that's not necessarily creative. Now, another example might be a word salad of a schizophrenic. There's just simply spewing of words with no rhyme or reason that is very original, but it isn't necessarily useful. And so we would not consider that to be creative or useful or adaptive. And so I think it's important, yes, to be original, but also to be useful in some way. Here's some thoughts taken from Human Motivation by Robert Franken. Creativity is defined as the tendency to generate or recognize ideas, alternatives, or possibilities that may be useful in solving problems, communicating with others, and entertaining ourselves and others. 3 reasons why people are motivated to be creative. First off, the need for novel, varied, and complex stimulation. Second, the need to communicate ideas and values. And third, the need to solve problems. And that third one is the one that we'll kind of focus on today. In order to be creative, you need to be able to view things in new ways or from a different perspective. Among other things, you need to be able to generate new possibilities or new alternatives. Now, tests of creativity measure not only the number of alternatives that people can generate, but the uniqueness of those alternatives. The ability to generate alternatives or to see things uniquely does not occur by chance. It is linked to other, more fundamental qualities of thinking, such as flexibility, tolerance of ambiguity or unpredictability, and the enjoyment of things that are heretofore unknown. And so, again, we come back to making order out of chaos. That's part of what the creative thinker does. Now, I believe that creativity is the ability to take bits of information either from the external world or from maybe sometimes from the internal world, although one could argue that what is in the internal world is but a reflection of the external world, be that as it may. But to take those bits of information and combine them and recombine them in novel and original and adaptive ways in order to create something new. Creativity is different, then, from talent. Now, the idea of talent actually comes from a biblical parable that Jesus told, where servants were given talents, which was actually a currency, numbers of, let's say, $100 bills, for example. And what they did with those determined how good of a servant they were at the end when the master came back. And so, like a talent, you have a skill, but that isn't necessarily what you do. It's the resources that you have to do something, but that isn't necessarily creativity. So talents and creativity are distinct, I would argue. Now, talent may be a component of creativity. The more talents you have, the more resources you have at play in order to be creative, but creativity is still distinct. Talent is a skill or aptitude in a domain or an effort. So like mathematics and poetry or music. So talent is usually identifiable early in life. People very early on in life, they tend to use certain symbol systems. So for example, some people might be very easily able to read or write music. Or they might be very adept at moving their fingers across a piano or keyboard or guitar, or being able to sing a song. Might have good kinesthetic intelligence, good music intelligence. Or they may be very adept at drawing something that looks just like reality. And those are, I would argue, talents. Everybody has talents, and there's variability between people in talents. So these are skills. These are talents. These are abilities to use a particular symbol system and manipulate it and understand it normally better than other people do. That is talent. That is different, I would argue, from creativity, which is more like a way of taking information and combining it and recombining it in ways that are novel and useful. Now, one of the big questions about creativity is it domain specific or is it general? That is, does a person who thinks or acts creatively be able to do so across different domains and through many different areas of their life? And so this is what is called the domain specificity debate of creativity. Now, I am of the opinion, and certainly you don't have to agree with me, is that creativity skills are transferable. And once you learn to think creatively, you have the ability to use that process, because I do believe that it is a process in many different areas of your life. You can use those skills in all the different areas of life, and that will depend upon your talents, how that gets expressed, and your interest in how that gets expressed. And your interests and your passions and your efforts are all part of how and where you decide to use creativity, but creativity is a little bit different. Now, oftentimes, if you hear of somebody that is a creative genius, they tend to be somebody that is talented in an area and can use their creativity in a specific area. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're creative in and of itself. Their creativity in and of itself is exceptional. That's more of an expression of the kind of laziness that we sometimes have in language rather than the specificity. But rather normally it is that they have a high level of talent in certain area, but their creativity might not be exceptional. So my key point here is that I want you to be able to recognize the difference between talent and creativity. Now, creativity, there are two different ways that we typically think of creativity. The first way is little c creativity, and the second way is big C creativity. Little c creativity is what we use all the time. It's what we think about. When we think of people like your grandmother doing pottery, or your mother knitting sweaters, or creating a nice meal. That's a little c type of creativity. It's an interest in creative activities in the everyday world. It's the ability to take items of normal everyday items and use them in ways that they weren't intended sometimes. And sometimes we can be creative and solve original problems, and we think in terms of alternate uses of creativity. And there are a lot of examples of this, like, for example, using a pallet of wood to make a fence, or taking wood from a countertop and fashioning it into, say, a lamp, or a lamp stand at least. But And here's a good example, I think. In the old movie, Apollo 13. In that movie, the astronauts, they're going to die, lack of oxygen, and unless they are able to develop a way of scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the air that they have left. And what they do is they take all the spare parts, all those parts that are somewhat useless, although there isn't a lot of useless stuff, but stuff that isn't critical to their survival, that are part in their small capsule, their own small little world. And from that, they create a system for scrubbing enough CO2 out of the air to allow them to survive just a little bit longer. And that would be a great example of creativity, in that it's taking everyday objects and using them in ways that they were not originally intended to use them for a very useful purpose. And that, I think, is what we mean by creativity. And I think these are great examples of using creativity, things in ways that we did not intend them, and we intend to use them for, and use them in novel ways. And this is, I would say, little c creativity. Although some of those ideas are profound and excellent, but big C creativity is something else. Big C creativity is what we think of as revolutionary, whereas little c creativity, I would argue, is evolutionary. It's small little steps. Big C creativity is thinking completely outside the box, changing an entire paradigm, changing the way a world thinks about something. It's something earth-shaking. It's new ways of doing things. Things like, for example, in the scientific community, Niels Bohr recognizing the quantizing of electrons. That was earth-shattering. It was paradigm-changing. It creates the foundation for what we have today as quantum physics and quantum entanglement and all the ideas that we have for quantum computing nowadays, as well as our foundation for simply understanding light, comes from this revolutionary creative idea of Niels Bohr, a theoretical physicist. And you wouldn't normally think of a physicist as being a creative genius, and yet I think that insight was a creative genius on par with the painting of the Sistine Chapel. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was paradigm changing. It was a change in the way that we present art. Just like the works of Beethoven were paradigm changing, and the ways of expressing music were changed forever and were profound and earth-shattering. They're paradigm changing ways of creating. They're revolutionary rather than evolutionary. And that, I think, is big C creativity. Now, another obvious example would be Newton. Newton's ideas of gravity, or Einstein's theory of relativity, or for that matter, the discovery of lithium as a treatment for bipolar disorder. These are all examples of revolutionary ideas that profoundly changed a field. I mean, who would think of using a common salt to change a mood disorder? And yet, someone had a problem, saw an inkling of truth, explored it, validated it, and we have this treatment now for bipolar. So that is big C creativity. And another one of the big questions in creativity research is there a qualitative difference between big C creativity and little c creativity? Or is it only a difference of the amount of qualitative versus quantitative creativity that's there? So, for example, some have written that there are geniuses of two kinds: those that are like us, but very much more so, and those that have that extra human spark. Now, some believe that there is a qualitative difference, but some believe that big C creators are very similar to small c creative thinkers, and so that's one of the questions that we will be exploring in this course. Not necessarily that we'll have a clear-cut answer, but I hope that you will see that there are some very common things between big C and little c creative people, creative workers. And so we'll be exploring a lot of the big C people to glean some of their gifts and skills and ways of being creative, particularly in the creative process. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about neuroscience, neurology. The neuroscience that forms the foundation for creativity. If we look at it, creativity from that perspective, it's very true that there seems to be a similarity between small c and big C creativity. But one area that I do believe that there is some variability between small c and big C creativity is in the powers of visualization. The ability to focus and visualize certainly seems to be a little bit greater for those with big C creativity rather than small c. But having said that, the underlying neurological structure is still there with both. So it isn't that Lenin's brain is better than another person's brain, or that Einstein's brain is different from your brain, for example. You have, in many ways, the same capabilities that Einstein or Beethoven had. And so let's look at that and look at a little bit of the history of creativity. And perhaps you will discover a luminary that you want to model your life after. And perhaps you realize that you have the potential to be a big C revolutionary creative thinker. So let's start off with a bit of the history of creativity, because I think that the nature of communication, of history and literature, are very important. But I will admit to something. A lot of my training was done in Europe. And I grew up in North America, which is very influenced on by the West. And so my knowledge is limited in some extent to the West. And so a lot of my perspectives as I talk about the history here is of the West. Now, I will acknowledge that there is a lot of Chinese creativity. There's and in South Asia, just as much creativity and a lot of documentation, particularly from the Dravidian eras in India, for example. A lot of creativity, just a massive amount of creativity there. It's just that I'm limiting this because of my own familiarity and knowledge to the West. So we'll take a look at the Greeks and the ancient Greeks, because I think they have some interesting perspectives that have kind of trickled down into our perception of creativity. Now, it's interesting, first off, that the Greeks had no real word for creative genius in that sense. In their common literature, they used the concept of inspiration, of something being breathed into them, literally being breathed into them from the gods. And so when Greeks viewed someone as being creative or performing a creative work, it was a celebration of that the gods had breathed into them the ideas or the abilities. And to do this creative work, the individual was then acting as a vessel of the gods. And so people did not necessarily produce the creative work. They were really just the go-between between the gods and the physical world. And now, Plato seemed to believe that creativity was divine madness, a type of madness that he outlines in a work known as the Phaedra. And Aristotle seemed to believe that, yes, there was a divine element to creativity, but that people had a little bit to do with it. So people were taking the inspiration from the gods and then using that inspiration and embellishing it a little bit, sometimes with imperfection, to create the work. And it's interesting that when the Greeks created and celebrated a created work and a creative luminary, say, for example, a playwright or a poet, they did celebrate the person who created the work, but they didn't celebrate them the way that you would expect. They didn't celebrate them for being great artists. They celebrated them for being chosen by the gods to create. And they congratulated them on being chosen by the gods. And so here's a quote from Hesiod, for example, on how poetry came. "Listen, you country bumpkin, you know how to tell many lies. We know how to tell many lies that pass for truth. And we know when we wish to tell the truth. So spoke Zeus's daughter, master of wordcraft, and they plucked the bridge and gave it to me as a staff, and breathed into me divine song, that I might spread fame of the past and of the future. That I may always begin and end my song with them." So, in Hesiod's view, Zeus is the source, and the muses, Zeus's daughters, were the source of his work. So the inspiration for his words were from Zeus. And then we can hear from someone like Archimedes, the great mathematician, ancient mathematician, is that we continually bewitched by some familiar siren. He forgot to take care of his body. He forgot to eat. He was dragged by force to the bath. All because he was bewitched by these geometric figures in his mind. And he would draw geometric figures in the oil when his body was anointed with oil. And he was overcome by pleasure by this because he was inspired by the gods. And then there's the idea of the muses being what we use in the vernacular as an inspiration for creativity, were descendants of Zeus. And so again, we see that in there. And our idea of a demon, of this disembodied spirit coming upon us, that word is actually literally in Greek means a state of mind. And so you have eudaimonia, which is a state of mind of happiness, of joy. But you get that imagery of something coming into you and taking you over and causing you to do something within creativity. And so sometimes that language gets mixed up in this kind of way of thinking of creativity. Creativity seems to be something that is outside the person, in the minds of the ancient person, but takes over the person. And then we have creativity through the Middle Ages. And there's a lot of question about what went on there, because we had this pre-Christian era in the classical period, and then in the Koine Greek period and the early Roman period, where there's a lot of creativity. And then we come into the Middle Ages with Christianity, and it doesn't seem that there's much creativity going on at all. And some would suggest that the dogmatic nature of religion suppressed the creative ideas. And so any ideas that were not in tune with this, were not in sync with the practice, were ostracized. And you do see that begin to happen a little bit in the 4th and 5th centuries in Christianity, with some of the creeds, where the creeds state this is what we believe and that you must believe this. And so you get this kind of dogma that starts to take a hold in culture, and that becomes very strong through the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries particularly. And so you have, for example, Galileo was convicted, for instance, of spreading the word about Copernicus's idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And it was very lucky for Galileo that he was friendly with some of the church leadership, or he may actually have been put to death at that time, because this was against church dogma within the Holy Roman Empire. Now, other scholars will argue that Middle Ages, the stagnation, had nothing to do with Christianity or dogma, and they give this as a reason. Because in the Muslim world at this time, dogma was just as strong. Islamic dogma was just as strong. And yet, in the Islamic world, there were great advances in mathematics and astronomy and art, and creativity was just exploding. So it wasn't just that there was dogma, but rather the difference between the Islamic world and the Roman world in the Middle Ages was one of conquest, of the Vandals, of the Mongols, of there being conquest going on, that and of the Black Death. And when you are struggling for food in a barren wasteland, and all of your physical property has been stolen or destroyed or taken away, and your cities have been sacked, and so there is physical distress, there is political distress, there's emotional and financial distress. In that kind of context, where an entire continent is covered in poverty and illness and violence, there just simply isn't the opportunity to flourish in times of poverty. Creativity, it seems, flourishes when basic needs are finally met within a person. If you're struggling to eat, you're not very interested in painting a masterpiece. Painting is something that happens after your survival needs are at least in some ways met, or you are using this as a means of surviving, as the struggling, starving artist image might have you believe. But really, creativity seems to be a place that does not thrive during barren times. And that, I believe, is probably a more accurate reason why there was not the flourishing that there probably should have been in the Middle Ages. But then we have the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, we see this explosion of creativity. So, for example, Michelangelo was probably the poster boy for this. He was also the poster boy of the creative personality, a moody, tormented individual that was driven to create. During the Renaissance, people no longer believe that people were inspired by the gods. Yes, people still used God as a subject of their work. So, for example, the Sistine Chapel. Many of the great statues of Europe and other architectural pieces are also kind of along those lines. You can think of David, the sculpture of David in Florence, Italy. But they believe that the actual ability in the Renaissance of being creative came from the humans themselves and not from the gods. I guess that's my key point here, is that there was now a celebration of the artist for their creativity, not just of them being a vessel. Now, when we move on to the Romantic era, we see that this is a response to the rational period. So in philosophy within Europe, there was kind of this dueling that went on between rationalism and empiricism. And in the midst of that you had the Romantic era, which was really kind of a response to the age of reason, where people could figure everything out. And they believed that things no longer came from the gods, but that they came from people. And so, in the end, there was a celebration of the mystery, of the emotion, of the limbic system, of the mystical aspects within the life of the artist that was a huge part of creativity. And so in the Romantic era, there's this mystical aspect that's given to the works. And so we see a celebration of secrets, of mystery. And we see the Romantics believe that creativity was sort of happening at the edges of sanity. That you had to be in a great emotional state between very highs and very lows in order to really, truly portray the human experience. Now, again, we've seen in more modern research that this isn't necessarily true, but there is certainly some luminaries that had extreme highs and extreme lows. And then in the 19th century, we have people like Sir Francis Bacon and Cesare Lombroso, and at the end and the beginning of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud. Now, here we are in a place in history where we moved from rationalism on to empiricism. And so within this 19th century, we have people like Sir Francis Galton, who used empirical methods to explore questions about heritability and about is genius something that is inherited? Is it something that is written within your genes? If you have genius parents, does that make you someone who will inevitably be a genius as well? Now, interesting fact, Francis Galton was also the Charles Darwin's cousin. So, one might say that there was an inevitability that Galton would be a genius in studying this. So Galton was someone that was very interested in the evidence and also in statistics. And in fact, he was one of the inventors of, creators of the statistical method that we today call correlation. Now, I do want to highlight here that Galton did not have exclusively good ideas. There are some ideas that have shown to be not of much value, really. So, for example, he researched the head sizes of creative geniuses and then compared them with people that were not known for their creativity in order to see if there was a difference. And this did not turn out to be a particularly fruitful area of inquiry. But when you're starting out with research, sometimes you go down dead ends and blind alleys, not knowing what you will find. And Galton was very much that way. But Francis Galton also had some very interesting ideas about what was going on in the mind, and also interested in maybe not necessarily what was going on consciously within the creative mind, but what was going on unconsciously. He was really looking at, is there a creative process? Something that's going on that you could catalog, that you could identify. And so one of the things that Francis Galton thought was that if he simply cataloged all the random thoughts that went through his head during the course of a day, he could have an insight into the creative process and the mind of a creative genius. And if he did go on a walk, perhaps he could discover this. And so he did that. He went on a walk and he attempted to catalog all of his thoughts during this walk. And this is sometimes known in creative research circles as Galton's walk, where he attempted to catalog all of these thoughts and perhaps all of the things that were going on even below the level of conscious awareness, which we now know was somewhat of a fruitless task, but it was also an interesting start to the exploration of the mind of a creative genius. But for Galton, it was an attempt to show that creativity isn't necessarily one thing, but it is the cumulative aspect of all the small, distinct parts. So all these thoughts and ideas, however fleeting they may be, that somehow they make up this whole that we think of as creativity and creative genius. Now, if you read Galton's description, he compares this analysis of thought to cleaning out a basement or exploring a basement and all of its inner workings. If you go down in a basement, you don't think much about it, but down there are pipes and sewers and furnaces, and all of this stuff needs to work, and you don't think about it, how well it works, until it doesn't work. And that's kind of like with the creative process. There's a lot going down there in the basement, in the sub-basement of the mind. And it's important to analyze the subconscious mind, because there's a great many things going on under the surface that oftentimes we simply ignore, but can have a profound effect upon how we live our lives and how we engage the world, particularly in creative ways. Now, we can't talk about Galton without also talking about the dark side of some of the effects that his ideas had. And if you have any familiarity with Galton at all, you'll know where I'm going with this. Now, because Galton was interested in heredity, he allowed his mind to go to that place where, well, if we understand heredity, could we possibly, say, for example, make better human beings? Could we selectively breed, for example, people that are geniuses in order to make a super intellectual, super creative race of people? And so this idea, this term, came to be known as eugenics, the manipulation of genes through breeding. We know that farmers and ranchers have been doing selective breeding for thousands of years to get preferential breeds in animals. Why can't we do this with people? And then we fast forward a few generations and we have this idea being picked up for nefarious purposes by the Nazis. And we all know how that turns out. So that was clearly a negative consequence of some of these lines of inquiry that Galton was following simply out of intellectual curiosity and interest, and not for nefarious purposes or ideas. So that what he tends to get known for is eugenics rather than for his research on creativity and creative genius. But of course, the two things do tie together to some extent, and heads that very negative, hence we have that very negative consequence within the 1930s and 40s with Nazi Germany. Now, so that's just a little bit about Galton. The next individual I want to kind of just highlight a little bit is Cesare Lombroso, who was a neurologist and criminologist in Italy. Now, because of his background, you can see where this is going, I think, in that Lombroso was very interested in the creative genius, but he saw a great deal of commonality between genius in creativity and degeneracy in morality. In that, and he highlights this in a book called The Man of Genius. Now, part of Lombroso's work is based upon some of the creative luminaries that he studied. But what he found was that oftentimes the creative luminaries, at least that he studied at least, disregarded the feelings and considerations of others. And this disregard of feelings and experience of others is, at its core, the core feature of, say, for example, a violent psychopath. And so he recognized this and saw that there may be some genetic link between the two. Now, what we found now is that there isn't necessarily a strong link between the two, and it was likely more of an artifact of his limited pool of candidates that led him to this conclusion. But it did influence how we think about creative geniuses to some extent. The ways that we see creative geniuses in the broader society. And so I think that it is in itself something that is valuable to keep in mind, that while his idea that creativity was in some way a deviance may not necessarily be true, it is a kind of a half-truth that floats out there in the modern generic public thought about some creative geniuses. So we need to be mindful of that. And then we come to one of my favorite people, Sigmund Freud, the archaeologist of the mind, the first person to truly analyze the subconscious and to pull back the curtain into all the impulses and drives that really form the foundation of who we are. As we are made up of some drives of sexual pleasure, for example, our eros drive, as well as our drive to destruction, our thanatos drive. So within this Freudian psychic apparatus, we have what we call the id, which is our base drives. That is our primary level of functioning. And it is something that is beyond or below the level of conscious awareness. And Freud saw that there was an element of creativity that was based within this primary level of drive within the id itself, that helps and nurtures the strength and power and direction of creativity oftentimes. And this primary type of thinking, the easiest way to keep in mind is to think in order to understand this primary mode of thinking, is to think of a 1-year-old or an infant or a 2-year-old. They think with this primary process way of being. It's very simplistic, very highly symbolic way of thinking. And it often is something that as an adults we would experience as dreaming, in the dream state. But it's very valuable. It's a way of taking the chaos, the unfamiliarity of information, and organizing it and making sense out of it in some kind of symbolic way. And I think that this is part of the power that creative people are able to use. And that is why it is so valuable in creativity. It takes chaos and tries to make order out of it in some way. Now, as we hit between 5 and 7 years old, we begin to develop a secondary process thinking, which is a more logical, rational, sequential way of thinking, a concrete way of thinking, and then eventually an abstract way of thinking that follows rules and guidelines and principles that we have learned and that can build up on those and lead to help us understand natural consequences. And that's something that as adults we would expect that we would use most of our lives. Now, not everybody uses purely secondary level processing, and I think the pandemic has shown that there are a lot of people out there that very easily reject secondary level process thinking and live and prefer to live exclusively in primary process thinking. Now, here's the thing. Creative people, according to Freud, use a lot of primary process thinking in their creative works. But so do madmen. Psychotic people also use a lot of primary process thinking in their works. Neurotics and psychotics, to use the kind of Freudian language, use primary process thinking. But there's a difference between a mad person, psychologically unhealthy person, and necessarily a creative genius, in that the creative genius has developed a skill of selectively, willingly, in an organized way, regressing into the primary process thinking in order to harness the gifts, the skills and talents and ways of organizing information in a flexible way in order to organize the chaos. And then they're able to leave that primary process thinking and move back into secondary thinking again. And that is different from someone that is just mentally ill, because they're stuck. The mentally ill person is stuck in their primary process thinking and cannot move out of that chaos and cannot think in deeper, more rational ways. And so it is, in Freud's view, the foundation of a creative mind, creative genius, is the ability to harness the powers of primary process thinking, the latent, flexible abilities that we were born with and develop in our early ages and simply are not. And so a creative person is not simply caught in the rigidity of the normal, everyday, logical adult. They can selectively regress when they need to, when the need presents itself in order to fulfill a task, to complete something, to be useful in some way, but then to move back into the logical realm again. Now, that is not to say that Freud did not think that some creative endeavors were not the result of anxiety, for example, because he did think that, in fact, a lot of creative work, a lot of creative passions that people have are just mechanisms for protecting themselves. They're self-protection mechanisms that he called defense mechanisms, ego defense mechanisms, to protect the self, the sense of self, as a good, productive, or maybe even to encourage the belief that they are a special person. And so we engage in these creative pursuits, and in so doing reduce our anxiety and protect ourselves in some ways. And so Freud would say that defense mechanisms are ways of deceiving ourselves, in a sense, into believing that we are more important perhaps than we truly are. And that would be kind of an existential perspective, I guess I would say, my existential perspective on Freud. But I do think it's a relatively accurate way of Freud's perception. But one could argue that the term that Freud used, sublimation, for creative pursuits, that sublimation was to sublimate essentially a sexual drive or sexual frustration and move that into creative pursuits or creativity, was a guise. But some might argue that Freud's whole passion for psychoanalysis was in many ways sublimation. So, be that as it may. So that brings us more or less to the modern age and our view of the history of understanding creativity. And going over this again, the Western world, to the Greeks, viewed creativity as being creative artists and the creative individual being used by the gods. They were vessels to be used by the gods to create a work. And so the celebration of the artist wasn't necessarily of them creating the work, but of the celebration of them being used and selected and chosen by the gods as a vessel of creativity. The Romantics then saw creativity as mystical inspiration, of being inspired by the mysteries of God, and so God was not necessarily the prime mover of creativity, perhaps the subject of creative works, but the prime mover of creativity for the Romantics was indeed the person, the artist, and their own experiences of the mysteries of the universe. And then Cesare Lombroso saw creativity as a form of degeneracy, an expression of uncaring for others. And Freud saw creativity as, in many ways, a defense mechanism, although some would argue that Freud himself sublimated very well, to use his own term, because he himself was really a creative genius at understanding and delving into the chaos of the human mind and trying to make sense of it in a useful and productive way. And so let's look a little bit more at creativity. I'm just going to pull a few ideas from a work called Creativity, Flow, and the Psychology of Discovery and Invention by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. We'll talk a little bit more about him as the course goes on, because I think he's really fascinating in some of his works. But he kind of points out a few things. Ways that creativity is commonly used. The term, persons who express unusual thoughts, who are interesting and stimulating. In short, people who appear to be unusually bright. Another way that creativity is used is that people who experience the world in novel and original ways. These are personally creative individuals whose perceptions are fresh, whose judgments are insightful, who may make important discoveries that only they know about. And then finally, individuals who have caused changes to culture in very important ways. Because of their achievements are by definition public, it is easier to write about them. So people like Leonardo da Vinci, Edison, Picasso, Einstein, people like that. And then Csikszentmihalyi would also argue that there are system models of creativity, that the creative domain, which is nested in culture, there is the symbolic knowledge that's shared by a particular society or by humanity as a whole. So, for example, there's the visual arts, that's a creative domain. Then there's a field, which includes all the gatekeepers of the domain. So, for example, art critics and teachers and curators of museum. And then there's the individual person, who, using the symbols of the given domain, such as music or engineering or business or mathematics, has a new idea or sees a new pattern, and when this novelty is selected by the appropriate field for inclusion in the relevant domain, then you have that revolution in creativity, that big C creativity. And creativity is an act. It's an idea or product that changes an existing domain or that transforms an existing domain into a new one. What counts is whether the novelty that the individual produces is accepted for inclusion in that domain. And we'll see that as we look at the process of creativity as we move forward with this lecture. And there seems to be some characteristics of creative personality. Creative individuals have a great deal of energy, but they also often have quiet times when they're at rest. Creative individuals tend to be smart, yet also naive at the same time. Creative individuals have a combination of playfulness and discipline, or responsibility and irresponsibility. There's some flexibility in the midst of the rationalism that's in there. Creative individuals alternate between imagination and fantasy on the one hand, and rooted in a sense of reality in the other. And again, you see that difference between that movement between the primary and secondary processes. Creative people seem to harbor opposite tendencies on the continuum between extroversion and introversion. So there's times when they can be both. They're one or the other. Creative individuals are also remarkable for being humble and proud at the same time. There's an openness, there's a flexibility that's there, there's a rebelliousness and yet a conformity, all of which ties together within the creative personality. So this is just some interesting pictures that I'd like to share with you. Now, what I'd like to do is continue on and talk a little bit about the creative process and the skills that are sometimes needed to be creative. In fact, I would argue this is a kind of a prerequisite for big C creatives, because they do believe that in many ways we can learn to be creative thinkers and creative, inventive people. And I really do believe that. And we're very lucky in our day and age that we have first-hand descriptions of the creative process and what goes on within a person's mind as they are in the midst of doing a work, are focusing on the task and coming up with novel and creative and useful solutions to challenges and to problems. Now, in the 1920s, there was a researcher by the name of Graham Wallas who wrote a book called The Art of Thought. And this work really gives us a good picture into the first gleanings of understanding the creative process. So in looking at creative luminaries, Wallas took this information, began to create stages or steps within the creative process. And so we have this based upon primary data and organized based upon what people were going through in the creative process. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at people down through the ages that have reflected upon creativity and problem solving, they seem to fall very nicely into Graham Wallas's creative process. So, for example, Archimedes was one of the first people to identify that aha, eureka, illumination moment. So, if you recall, Archimedes was a mathematician from ancient Syracuse who was contacted by a king to evaluate whether or not some metalsmiths were cheating him out of his gold by fashioning a crown. And it was Archimedes' job to calculate whether or not this was in fact the case. And Archimedes was struggling with this problem, how to figure out mathematically and there he was, focusing on this, so much so he forgot to clean himself. And so finally some people say, hey, buddy, you're smelling too bad. Go have a bath. So he goes and has a bath, and in moving around in the bath, some of the water flows across, and he sees this, and he realizes, I am displacing water by my shape, by my mass. I am displacing water. And gold can do the same thing. And so I can figure out the volume by how much water is displaced. Now, he wasn't actively calculating at the time that he was having the bath, but there was a part of his mind that was working the problem in the background. And in that moment came up the solution to the problem. In a way, there was an emotion into the problem, then there was the incubation period, then there was the revealing of the answer within the unconscious to the conscious. In that aha moment, that eureka moment, that illumination moment. And so Archimedes cried out, Eureka! I found the answer. Another great story from history is Kekula, a chemist who was determined to understand the nature of the element, the molecule benzene. And Kekula had been working the problem day in and day out, and yet could not find and understand the true nature of benzene. And when it's in his downtime, as he's relaxing by the fire, when an image came to him within the fire, the image of a snake biting its own tail. And that creative imagery, that primary thinking, that symbolic thinking coming to mind, and it made so much sense. And it was all of a sudden, benzene made sense. All of that chaos that he'd been struggling with came into creative order out of that in a form of a symbolic understanding of the molecule benzene. Aha, benzene is a ring. And so now he discovered, he'd understood the true nature of benzene. And then we have Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart recalls having a meal, riding in a carriage, and on the way home through the uneven streets of Vienna, very tired, dozing off, and then all of a sudden a symphony comes to his conscious awareness, fully formed, complete, and all he has to do is write it down. Now, I think we will see that it took years and years and years of thinking in, processing, and focusing in order to get the mind working on the problem. But even when the conscious mind is not working, the unconscious mind is in some ways working the problem. The unconscious mind is moving those primary parts of the mind in very powerful, creative ways and working on it and eventually revealing what it comes up with to the conscious awareness. And so we have that subjective experience of the creative luminary like Mozart of receiving a fully formed symphony there in the carriage on a lonely evening in Vienna. And there are many, many examples, and I'm sure that in our readings you will see many other first-hand examples. How is it that people can work the problem for a period of time? Things simply come to them in their off moments, drinking coffee, and all of a sudden, great mathematical formulas come to you. It isn't that you weren't thinking about mathematical formulas for a period of time or working very, very hard up until that moment. It was that your subconscious mind that has finally put everything together and was revealing it to you. Remember, you aren't just your conscious awareness. You aren't just your secondary thinking. You are primarily your primary thinking. And that has some great power that you need to use, and or that can be used for the revolutionary kind of moments. Whereas the logical secondary side is more for the evolutionary, the small steps that move forward. So all you had to do in this case, in the case of one of the accounts, is to write down the formulas that popped into your head. It's a gift from the gods. But we now know that it is part of that creative mental process that goes on with creative luminaries, creative geniuses, and geniuses of any type go through this creative process. So what you typically find is that creative, inventive people will report that a large part of the creative process is not logical. It is really rather illogical. It's part of that unconscious part of the mind. And we can see that this is certainly something that we see in the perspectives of the reports of creative luminaries. But when we look at the psychological understanding of creativity or the inklings of it, we begin to delve into that and recognize that there are these steps within the creative process. So as I mentioned, we have Wallace, who recognized the first steps in that process back in 1926. And the very first step in that creative process for Wallace is preparation. That is, delving into the question. And then comes incubation, which is the time in which you set aside the question that you're dealing with and allow the irrational parts to try to make sense of the chaos that's going on. Then there is the stage of illumination, where the unconscious mind, that irrational primary part of the mind, reveals what is coming up within it. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. But when it is good, it is proved to be good, and it is phenomenal. And that, of course, brings us to that stage of verification, of testing the answer that was given by the unconscious parts of the mind, the unrational parts of the mind, informing this chaos, is into something that makes sense. And when something is verified, then we know that it was truly created because it is useful. And it is wonderful. Now, what has really happened for the past few decades with these stages of understanding the creative process, really stayed relatively stable. But recent researchers do have a few things they would like to tweak a little bit. First off, researchers suggest that it is that the verification be broken into two sub-stages, one of evaluation and one of elaboration. And then finally is, in the modern research, we've also added that final stage known as restitution, which basically means that after you've gone through an intensive creative process, the mind needs to rest a little bit because you immersed yourself in something for so long, so intensely. You can just simply become weary and kind of dysfunctional. And so there needs to be a time of kind of resetting yourself so that you're ready to go through this process again. But after that time of restitution, the mind is very receptive to, again, engaging in that creative process and of coming up with new novel ideas, new ways of thinking and problem solving. And by using this process, we can really do some really wonderful work. In fact, one of my favorite ways of doing phenomenological research, which is the study of subjective human experience, is to use this basic method. Now, in social science research, we call this heuristic research, but it's essentially Wallace's steps in the creative process of thinking, which is essentially the structure that that Wallace puts forward, where this process of creative problem solving. In heuristic research, you have immersing yourself in a selected question, immersing yourself in the question. So there's that first stage of immersion. Then there is the incubation, and then the illumination, and then what is known as creative synthesis, where you have your findings that were revealed to you, and you find the best way to express that truth that comes from it, and understanding that it is essentially the creative parts of your mind helps you to really kind of understand and be able to research the subjective human experience very well. So it's an example of a way of using this creative process. And fields other than art, for example, use this. So it's a good method, social science method for doing phenomenological research, for example. So just an interesting aside. So for being a creative genius, you need to go through these steps, but it isn't easy. Because it isn't just as simple as going through steps. Yes, you need to take these steps, but the steps are not necessarily all that easy. So, for example, let's look at that first phase step in Wallace's creative process, preparation. Well, first off, you need a lot of general information, so you need to go to school. You need years of life experience in going to school. So you need to spend some time gathering general information about the question, the issue, the problem that you're going to be dealing with. And this means a lot of general information, but also a lot of specific information and the use of skills so that you have a lot of material to work with, as well as learning the specific domain. So, for example, Einstein went to school, studied for his PhD. The specifics about the problem and the detail of the problem. You also need to observe the problem and the situation around the problem in the many different situations so that you can create a level of adaptability within that. You need some skill in dealing with this issue. And all of that is going to take time, and it's going to take effort. And so you really can think in terms of that rule of 10,000 hours of developing the basic skills around and of the knowledge of the topic in order to really be a creative genius. Someone that is revolutionary rather than evolutionary is going to put in that time. And so it's going to take some focus. And someone is not going to spend 10,000 hours working on something unless they feel that they have some kind of giftings in that field. And that's where that connection of talents and creativity often can get a little murky. That they are getting some reward from this field, either emotionally or relationally, and in some ways within themselves. And so all of that is going to play into the whole stage of preparation. So it isn't simply just gathering your paints on a table. There is a whole deep process of living a preparation. The process that goes into that revolutionary creative genius is a difficult, long one. Otherwise, everybody would be a creative genius. So if you're going to be, say, a great sculptor, well, you have to learn the nature of many different things, of materials, if you're going to be great. If you're going to be a painter, you need to understand the nature of different types of paints and materials and canvases and lighting. If you're going to be a great filmmaker, you need to understand and study intensely the arts of storytelling, of emotional manipulation, of cinematography and photography and lighting, and all of these little nitpicky, seemingly isolated things, unrelated parts that go into the whole, need to take time, need discipline. It takes effort. It takes sustained interest in order to move through this preparation phase adequately. Preparation is, of course, also about observing the trends within your field, observing the latest technology, the latest techniques, knowing where things are going, knowing the current state of knowledge. All of this is extremely important. It's about being able to contribute something that is useful, remember. And that is part of that creative process. It's something that is useful, something that is novel, something that is unique. Something can be unique, but if it isn't useful, then it isn't really worth anything, and it's not going to be accepted. Then you need to identify the problem, the question that you will be delving into. And sometimes this is something that comes from making an observation that nobody else has made, or finding a niche within the field. Sometimes this is a problem that is presented to you by a historical context, so that you are the one that needs to do and deal with the problem in a unique way. But then, if you do it in a useful way, you can be a creative genius. Sometimes it is simply selecting a problem. Let's take the artists, the pointillists. Pointillists chose the problem, how we can use light. In art, how can we highlight the use of light in art? And from there, we can have some very creative, interesting works that do indeed use light in unique and distinct ways to create a very fascinating, beautiful experience for people, and so it is useful. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with what a pointillist is, pointillism is a technique of painting in which small, distinct dots of color are applied in patterns to form an image. And it's kind of an offshoot that's first developed in 1886, and it's a bit of a branch of Impressionism. Now, my point here is that there's always problems to be found out there, and really the process of finding a problem or finding a question is really not all that difficult. It's like anything else. And so it's something that we do very naturally and very automatically, but sometimes we find it hard to really kind of recognize that we do it because we don't think about it. So we don't realize that there's a process to it. But there is indeed a process, and in order to think of a question, just reflect upon, basically what annoys you, because your emotional structure, your limbic system, is constantly evaluating your environment for problems, for things that are going on in order to protect you. And so if something annoys you, there's probably a problem there that you can look at and explore and delve into and find a creative solution for. Okay. So you want to spend, we don't want to spend too much time on that first step within the creative process. I also want to kind of highlight incubation because this is really key. While we need to consciously work on the problem and rationally work on the problem, we need to spend time focusing on the problem in order to really move on to incubation. If we don't do the preparation, we're not going to ever move on to incubation, because you need to really kind of work this hard in order for it to get embedded into our subconscious mind so that we can actually use it. But when we have gone through the process of working things out logically, and when we tap into that other level of power of our primary processing, we're moving to that revolutionary level Whereas logical, rational focusing is evolutionary, the revolutionary is the big C creative, the primary emotional processing that we were born with for problem solving. The evolution process can fatigue us. Consciously, we can be fatigued by it, but your unconscious mind is very capable at working in the background on this problem if you set it to the task of doing so. And you don't clutter it up with dealing with all sorts of other problems. So, one of the first things that you can do is unclutter your unconscious mind by getting into a routine within life, so that you're not thinking, for example, about what kind of socks you're going to wear every morning. That clogs up your unconscious mind. So for Einstein, for example, wore the same socks all the time, the same type of socks. He just had dozens and dozens of pairs of socks. So he never had to spend time matching socks. And you would think that's not a big deal, but that takes a little bit of brain space. And when you get into a routine where you can free up parts of your mind from these mundane tasks, then you have more time to allow your unconscious mind to work on the big creative problems. And eventually, if you're patient and you've done the preparation work, the answers will begin to reveal themselves to you. It may take a day, it may take a month, it may take a year, but trust the process. And if you're getting frustrated with the process, then reflect upon it. Ask your subconscious mind, are you still working on this? Now, it might be that you can't come up with an answer because you haven't done enough preparation. So maybe you need to go back and do the preparation some more. But when illumination happens, it usually comes after a period of incubation. And so the illumination comes when the unconscious mind is finally coming up with the solution. And it then illuminates it to the conscious mind. It's like it pulls back a curtain and there's the answer just sitting there. And at that point, you can start to do something about it. And I hope you see there that this is a predictable pattern of creative geniuses that applied not only the artistic sense, but it's something that's also been applied to scientific discoveries as well as a lot of engineering inventions. And so it does appear to be simply coming out of thin air, being a gift from the gods, or being something that just comes fully formed to you and presenting itself to your consciousness. And yet there is a lot of other things going on in the background that we now finally, through careful research, know about. And that you know about now so that you can harness the power of the creative process in your own research, in your own life, in your own creative pursuits, to be a revolutionary creative genius in your own field. So, all you need to do is choose a domain, put in the 10,000 hours, find your question, put your mind to the task of that question. Trust in the process of illumination, incubation, and then finally illumination, and then be open to actually synthesizing it and presenting it and validating it. And that is it for our week about the history and process of creativity. I hope you enjoyed this week. You take care. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.